you. Thank you for our joint host for having me here tonight. I have to start off with a very frank confession in that I'm not an expert or historian of the Southwest. I have been in and out of Washington now for almost 10 years, so I have some opinions about what I see and what its potential is, but I'm very lacking in actual facts of history and detail. So if I make mistakes in recalling certain things, because I'm always worried about coming to Washington because it's a city full of really smart people who they all have very strong opinions about certain things. But you know, tonight I really want to actually dedicate my little talk to Jane Jacobs, an American citizen who came to Canada, and actually everybody talks about Canadian cities and success of Canadian cities, but you know, she had enormous influence in Canada. I think she influenced Canadian cities much more than American cities. So all the good things you can say about Canadian cities, really, we have to give thanks to Jane Jacobs, because just last week I was in Bellagio in Italy, one of 20 architects from different parts of the world, talking about Jane Jacobs' influence. And 50 years after Jane Jacobs and 50 years of the life and death of American cities, they're writing the book, and what happens 50 years from now, what are some of the lessons. And truly, I think she was an individual that made tremendous impact on our urban landscape. For me personally, this was Southwest. You can see the year, 1951. And I came to Washington as a student of architecture on a scholarship in 1964. This is close to the time what I saw when I stood at Enfant Plaza. And it changed my life, because I took one look out there and I said, this can't be the way to build cities. It actually, you know, we came to really look at the Goodman buildings that are, you know, down here, and then the IMP buildings. And it really, I actually forced the professor to change the whole tour. We were supposed to go and look at iconic buildings of America, especially on housing, and I was able to convince him, there were 6 of us on the tour, one from each school of architecture, to change the whole tour. We wanted to go look at the inner city neighborhoods of America, because I said, you know, we can't allow this to keep going like this. This is not the lesson for building cities. And luckily this professor obliged by allowing us to do this, and we went to Detroit, we went to Baltimore, and I remember as we had to write a paper at the end, and I said, look, it's all going to blow up, because it just cannot keep going this way, and surely all the urban riots happened a year or 2 later. But, you know, Arena Stage somehow headhunted me 10 years ago. They found this Canadian architect in Vancouver and said, you know, come. And so I came and was very much inspired by Molly Smith. The story was I came incognito because I just wanted to see what was happening, and I asked to see Molly at the end. And so we met, and I asked her for her mission statement. And she said, you're the only architect that ever asked me about my mission statement. And I particularly like these, you know, deep and dangerous, because I thought that was an interesting challenge as a client. But she very much kind of inspired the design of the Arena, and many of you have visited Arena, so I wasn't going to talk too much about the design process, but there are certain elements that I want to talk about. In that, when I first came, I spent my time just walking the streets. I think the first 2 or 3 weeks, I just walked around the neighborhood and hung around the waterfront, because I'm a boater. I like to sail, so I talked to all the people, liveaboard people that was along the waterfront, just to learn about the history. And I started to draw some diagrams just for my own interest. These are the kind of monuments of the Capitol, and then I saw this axis to the Washington Monument, and then a very important axis to the East Potomac Park. And then, of course, you know, realizing what happened with the freeway. And the blue lines are the kind of streets that you can get to the Capitol on. And then all the red ones that are coming up, this is the Jane Jacobs stories. These are all the red streets. There are 22 of them that were cut off. So these major super blocks were created. So this whole section of the city was cut off from the capital. And then I kind of penciled in redevelopment potential areas in this area. And it was at that point that I met with Mayor Anthony Williams regarding Arena, and I showed these diagrams. And he said, well, I'm thinking about doing the Anacostia development plan. Why don't you join the team? So together with Andy Altman, I can concentrate it mainly in this area as part of my contribution. And looking at the potential of what happens, you know, with the channel and enlivening it. And so, you know, indicated, you know, this pinch point right here that, you know, in terms of solving that is very difficult. Banneker Point, of course, this great overlook, but you have the transit station here, but it's very difficult getting from the transit station to the point and from the point down to the fish market. Saw the potential of Arena, of course, and then all the property along the Navy Yard, etc. And then suggested this idea of a number of little ferries that could take you around the area. But more importantly, it was an idea that didn't show up in this diagram was, and I think Clover Smith also suggested at one time a kind of Ponte Vecchio across here so that you can get from one side to the other, and some other people did, and I also reinforced the idea of maybe in the future a channel right through here. So you can then get from this side, rather than backtracking, get to Georgetown. Now, of course, some people then say, Bing, you're crazy because you'll never get that across to convince anybody, because that golf course is so popular with people from Congress. So that was the end of that story. But in looking at it in more detail with the transit stop, the proposal was that you had to have one entry at this point, but then knowing the potential of the waterfront and its redevelopment, that the idea is to create Arena as a kind of a shortcut so that people from the neighborhood can actually walk through Arena from one end to the other. And for those of you who have spare time, we did implement that. You can now walk in the front door at Arena and go across, go right through Arena and come down a set of stairs at the patio and connect to the water. So I'm very hopeful that this will continue to happen, and Arena then, even with the restaurants and the bar, can function as a part of the city's fabric. But when we first started, this is existing, the fish handler and the Krieger, and then of course all the administration was in the middle, and each of them had their own entry, one facing this way and one facing that way. So they had their backs to each other as a kind of a Siamese twin. So the idea here was to take the administration out and bury the administration underneath and create then a lobby that all three of the theaters can share, and then put a roof over it, and then that way glaze the edge and solve the acoustical problem, because the existing Fitchandler and the Krieger had only single wall construction, so external noise were coming in from the airplanes and from the emergency vehicles. So there you have the Fitchandler, the Krieger, and the new theater called the Cradle. And so there's the existing buildings, and all we did was kind of shrink wrapped it and put the building inside. So it was a kind of a muscular, kind of brutalist building of the era, and by putting it inside, it became a piece of furniture. And so it's much more friendly to walk up to now, and you can touch it, and you can stroke it, and it won't bite you, and it will, you know, be very friendly. So that was the simplistic idea of actually solving this and creating what I call 3 jewels in a jewel box. And I've always publicly have said Washington takes itself too seriously, so this is a building that has some humor and some gracefulness and sensuousness about it. So the Fitchandler Theater we handled very, very carefully, because I wanted to save the strength of the theater, and Harry did such a great job in creating this space. But we did close off these little boxes that were on the side, because sound was going in and it wasn't coming back out. And we repositioned all the catwalks, so that at one time when the actors were speaking this way, audience on this side could not hear, but you see these little baffles that are there? So the sound actually reflects off that and bounce back. So you might notice that next time you go to the Fitchandler and look at these baffles. But we did it so carefully that we didn't want to change the overall feeling of the theater. It's still a very tough kind of boxing ring or hockey ring type space. And it's a wonderful, wonderful theatrical space. And then we did all the air conditioning, so the air now comes out from under the floor, so the ladies won't get cold shoulders, you know. All the electrical, we had to feed all the electrical wire up through the ceiling. We didn't change the ceiling. We took the wood down, but we put it back up. So there were hundreds of meters of feet of wiring that went up. See, for the control rooms in the earlier days, you may have a lighting change or sound change of 20 or 30 per performance. Now it's like 250 to 300. So the electronic controls for theatrical presentations have advanced so much. But we have to be very careful to incorporate that all in so that the spirit of the building it was still maintained. And largely the color that Harry set out, we maintained also. And then, of course, with the Krieger, that was his other theater. And the interesting thing about the Krieger is that the most proscenium stage houses that were built after the Krieger did not have the stage house out to the thrust. So when you go to the Krieger, it's actually one or two in America, maybe the only one in America, where you can actually get the scenery right down at the front of the curve. It's not used very often, but it's very unique in that theater. But the intimacy of the Krieger, we also maintained and largely kept. But we redid the roof. We made the roof as a part of the lobby. So it's kind of people watching people space. Molly always wanted the audience to collide at intermission. So people from one of the theater spaces can talk to others who have come to other shows and maybe entice them to come back the next week to see the other show. So it's a theatrical space for the audience, because audience are all thespian want-to-bes. And so it's actually, you know, a promenade area. And then the roof we made into a restaurant. Now this roof was designed to take snow loads. And so you couldn't put a lot of people on. So the middle part was made into a rock garden so that we didn't overly load the roof. So it was maintained for that. And then, of course, there is the kitchen, which is used by the staff. And that's where everybody meets. And what makes Arena unique is that it's active during the daytime, because it has classrooms and the staff are walking in and out, and the public are welcome to come through all the time. So which is quite unique, because usually theatrical lobbies are locked off and become quite dead spaces. And then, of course, the new theater is called the Cradle. And whenever Molly talked about that, it's the Kogart Cradle, but Molly always put her hands together and she said, we have to cradle new work, because this is where they're just being born. We have to treat them very gently. So we took her kind of inspiration and challenged her. I said, well, mother and father are very strong. The baby has to be strong also. But you can't just build another studio theater, or what we sometimes call black box. So we created this idea that as you come into this theater, you actually spiral around. So you lose the memory of the big space as you come into the small space. The small space is only 250 seats. But because you're spiraling around in this walk as you come through, the spaces are, your concept of space is changed. So when you turn the corner, you then discover this. But because of these curved shapes, they're very bad for acoustics, because they tend to focus. So we had to experiment. So Molly said, you know, when we do this kind of room, we don't have a lot of money for stage sets. So this room sometimes has to feel like a castle, sometimes feels like a ship, sometimes feels like a study, sometimes, you know, feel like a very neutral space, but sometimes it has to have personality. So we started to use boarding to try to create this, and then we finally came up with this idea of a basket weave, which is using pieces of wood and bending them, and then using what we call standoffs that creates these bumps, and then these horizontal lines to hold the room back down together again. And the story about this was that we built a mock-up in Vancouver, and we thought it would take about $250,000 to do this. When it went out to tender, it came in at $2 million. And luckily, because we did the mock-up, we did another one in Washington, brought the contractor back in, told him how simply it was to do, because we had furniture, millwork people tendering this. We finally got the drywallers in, and we told them this is just baseboards. So the price tag came back down to $250,000. So that's the idea of actually using the crafts and working with the craftsmen. And so it's become a very unique room, and there's really no other studio theater like it anywhere in the world. So the baby is now as strong as mother and father. Then, of course, I want to talk about these columns and this glass, because you had this earthquake here. And Molly called me about 10 minutes after the earthquake. She said, Bing, it's fantastic. Everything moved. All the glass moved, but nothing broke. He said, I'm still alive, you know. So I want to talk about how this was done, you see, because you see, these are columns that go up. It's holding the roof, and then it has two arms that comes out, and it's bracing the glass, and then there's a cable. Next time you go to Arena, you will see there's a cable up here. So this is in compression. That means all the weight of the roof and the glass is on here, but the cables are in tension. So the cables are cinching up, holding the weight of the glass, transferring that weight up to the roof and from the roof back down to the columns. But the interesting part about this is that, so there's the column, okay? That's a drawing of the top, this is a drawing of the middle, and this is a drawing of the bottom. So I'm going to go through each of those with you to show you. At the very top, there's a spring that cinches this, this cable, that keeps it taut and carries the weight of the glass. In the middle, there are these two arms that come out, okay? So you can imagine I'm standing here, I'm the column, there's the two arm, and this two arm is pushing against the glass, okay? So when the earthquake came, these arms were moving 6 inches. So all the glass were waving like a curtain, but nothing broke. Right? So it's a very unique kind of invention. There's the column, there's me, there's my two arms, and that's pushing against the glass, right? And then the cable cinches it all up. Right? And then at the base, we have this cable coming down, is anchored, and then the foot of the column is expressed like the ballet slipper. My wife was an ex-ballerina, so the idea of all that weight coming down to a point, I thought was an interesting way of expressing that, that combination. So, and then of course I was worried that this would kind of, this probably fluttered during the earthquake, probably moved 10 to 12 inches, I would think, because it's a cantilever. Right? So that's the salute to the Washington Monument. So that's once over likely someone, there's the stair that goes down to the waterfront, and in the future there'll be an elevator that can be positioned here. So you can get to Arena from both sides of the site. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about the new project we're doing. Is for the Rubels, the Randall School. I didn't know the Rubels. Somehow they heard about what we were doing and asked to meet, and came to Arena, and Marilyn Maconian's here in the audience. She's a partner with the Rubels. I think Marilyn had heard about what we were doing, and we had went through the building, and it was the shortest interview I have ever been to about getting a job. We had dinner afterwards, and I asked them, I said, why do you want to do this? And Mira said, well, I'm a refugee from Russia, walked out of there barefoot, 10 years old, and I want to do something for my adopted country. And Don Rubel says, well, Washington's full of 35 years old that are bored to death, nothing to do. I want to shake up this place a little bit. She said, all the institutions here are all kind of with boards, so they're always afraid to do something controversial. But we're private, so we can do anything we want. And so I said, well, do you have any money to build this? And they said, no, that's why we need you. So we're still trying to find the money to build this. But it's coming. Anyway, it has this wonderful view, potential view to the Capitol. But, you know, so much of it is dead-ended. This is the Southwest. You can see all these streets that are kind of cut up and dead-ended. And so, first of all, next to Arena, the proudest thing I have is really, together with the Office of Planning, took down the middle part of this mall, right, and just took 4th Street through again. It's made a great difference. But I think all these other streets, we need to find a way of reconnecting. And so I want to talk a little bit about that as we go. But we will look at the Southwest. You got this beautiful waterfront. Sasaki did this part of the landscaping, I think, is what holds Southwest together. Beautiful trees, great landscape architects. Dan Kiley and Sasaki on the waterfront. Very mature trees. One of the great secrets, I think, of Washington is the Southwest. And then, of course, you know, these are colors of Global Smith, these ones, and then I.M. Page, the gray. They're all kind of color-coded, different architects doing different projects. And so talking first about Global Smith projects, where, you know, the first one that was in the area near the Randall School. And it's interesting in that, you know, there are apartment buildings, but what's really interesting are all the townhouses in the back and the landscaping that Dan Kiley did. They're just magical spaces that, the one thing we need to do, I have to reinforce it, Southwest is a treasure of courtyards. Big courtyards, little courtyards. But the problem is they've all been gated. So they're gated communities, but if we could somehow get all the communities together and say, let's open up all the courtyards, and you can wander through the Southwest into spaces like this. They're really magical. If you haven't, you know, you go from one space to the other, and it's just a series of little rooms. Some are big rooms, some are little rooms. Very, very successful. And I think one of the, I don't know of many places in the whole United States or Canada that have this richness of experience through landscape treatment of public space. And then, of course, unfortunately, this Dan Kiley little pavilion was taken down, but I thought it's a beautiful little setting. And then, of course, this other project that she did with this, which is the opposite. Like, she did these little courtyards, and then she came down and she built this huge courtyard, right? It's like a French chateau, right? With a beautiful, once again, greenery created by Dan Kiley. And apparently, and some historian may have to correct me, but she tried to design this to age in place. Apparently there are, I've never been able to go inside, but apparently there are apartments of all different sizes, so that you could actually, you know, go in there as a young person and go out of there, you know, in an ambulance, I guess. But, you know, of different sizes, which I think was way ahead of her time in terms of thinking about variety and ways of living in a neighborhood. And then, of course, the Goodman buildings, you know, with their wonderful little courtyards, again, all different sizes, and these are little townhouses that are stacked. And these are the ones that I came to see when I was a student, because it was the first use of aluminum for residential architecture. And you can see some of the sunscreens where the aluminum was experimented with. And then across the street again, this is Morris Lapidus. Now, that is a Miami building, right? I mean, this is with big balconies and, you know, this kind of kinky Art Deco things that Morris is very good at. And then, of course, across the street, you have Harry Weiss's Chicago buildings, right? They're kind of robust, big, little windows, massive walls. And then stacked townhouses, 2 on 2, and then underground parking, experimenting. And then, of course, the I.M. Pei buildings, which once again have courtyard, very different again, with beautifully proportioned windows, very serene, and luckily now very well restored. And then smack in the middle of this, you can't believe, I mean, there she was. She did this water, you know, this terrible building in the middle. You know, and it's supposed to be the town center or the village center. And you know, I remember coming to Arena, it was a place nobody wanted to be at. It was supposed to bring, you know, this side of Southwest together with this side of Southwest, but it ended up nobody wanted to be there. And so, you know, but it was just a very unpleasant space. And so luckily now we punched it through, we let forth through, and the whole area is now changing. We're getting more retail. She's always wanted more retail in this area, and it was not successful in convincing the powers that be. And hopefully in the future we will have more of this retail strip. We need much more of this in the Southwest to create the urban fabric. And then of course you already have the transit stop, which will help it a lot. And then of course further on down you have another Morris Lapidus pavilion in the park. I've been here 10 years. I've never seen a single person in that park. But it's a wonderful little gazebo that have a lot of potential. But nobody goes there because it's, and then these streets. See, this is First Street, and I'm suggesting when we do the Randall School that we actually punch this back as a street again, because the street trees are still there. And it would be relatively easy to kind of re-stitch the city together again. And then, of course, nearby you get these government buildings. Everybody dislikes Southwest because they have to come here to get the car tested, right? And so that sets a certain mindset for people not wanting to come. And then, of course, you have vacant properties all over. And then, of course, you still have the Greenleaf housing project, which was built at the same time, at the very early parts of the redevelopment. And so the potential of what to do with Greenleaf and how to reinvigorate and redevelop this and revitalize this area and allow people to stay in this area but have the housing structures improved, and because they're cheek to jowl with the IMP buildings, right? And then, of course, nearby, you have the Capitol Skyline, and the Rubels own the Capitol Skyline, so they will now have two property kitty corner to each other. And the potential of that, of course, with the great swimming pool and all the wonderful parties they have, and the Emerge Art Fair that happened a couple of weeks ago, and all these beautiful people that hang out on the weekends. So, you get this kind of very interesting, eclectic kind of interior that Morris was very good at. And then, of course, you can see all the development that's happened now in Southwest and in the Southeast. And then, of course, you've got this swath in the middle that is waiting for ideas as to what could happen. Nobody's hired me to do any of this yet, so I was just kind of thinking about it. So, but the idea of South Capitol, of course, it's a very unfriendly street. You take your life in your hands, you try to cross it. So this great divide between the two sectors of the city is still there. And then, of course, I think NCPC developed this diagram, right? The potential of kind of calming that street down and making it pedestrian friendly again. So these are the kind of challenges we have. So there's the Randall School. Now, I'm going to show you some early renderings or models of what we're thinking about. It's not there yet, but the genesis of idea is there. So these three buildings are historically listed. This one in 1920s, and then the others are a little later, 1930s, 1940s. So the complex on a square block is this. So these are the three buildings that has to be maintained. These latter ones are not as important, so we're going to take those down. And so the idea is to encapsulate them with townhouses and then punch a street through in the middle, because I Street is too narrow to be used for drop-off, so you create an interior courtyard with a street coming through the middle. And then you use the existing building as a central component for both the art museum and the residential and whatever restaurants or other retail uses we could have, and enliven I Street again with retail spilling out onto I Street. And then what I call the necklace, that's the art museum in the center of the project. And then looking down to create this courtyard, which is about the same size as the MoMA Museum in New York, which brings some sunlight into the middle of the space, and then above that, more residential projects. So there it is. I mean, in terms of stitching that part of the city again. And then I thought I would end to just talk a little bit about a more recent project we're doing in Vancouver. Here, I've been working in an edge city in Vancouver, very much like the Southwest, where they have a series of very large blocks, where once again, I develop a plan to kind of bring smaller city blocks back. Here, we put a university on top of a shopping center. That's been very successful. And then here, recently, we developed a plan for a new city hall, a new library, and a new performing arts center venue in the middle. And so we just, 20 months ago, was given a commission through infrastructure funding program that to spend $30 million in 18 months to build a new central library for this suburb of Vancouver. So this is the footprint that we had to work with. And so the idea was to develop this 80,000 square feet building within this footprint. And this is a model that we created. So this would be a civic plaza, and these windows are facing north and east, so we could afford to have very large windows coming in without too much heat gain. And then there was a street that was curved, so we developed a kind of robust wall on this side that followed the curve of the street, and have very few windows on this side, very few windows to the south. So those of you who've been to Arena, you know we did this cradle that's this kind of inverted cone that's sloping. Well, this is taking it one step further. This is a section of a cone. It's curved, but it's also sloping at the same time. So geometrically, it's actually a tilted cone on a flat ground plane. And in order to do this, we use the same type of forming system that we used at the Arena. It's a pariform. It's a German system that will curve and bend and tilt at the same time. So it allows us to create these shapes. And so we had to develop this is the forming pattern, but because the windows were at a certain shape, we had to line it with a plywood sheathing behind this. So we had to teach the contractor how to build this building. And how to have the windows and the walls all on the same module. So the way we tackle these complex buildings is we use very complex geometry, but we use very simple building methods. And by using the simple building methods, and we teach the contractor how to do it, we drive the construction price down. So that's something that we get involved with it as an office very early in our practice. So we actually developed this, and we thought it would take $5.5 million to build this concrete wall, and the contractor came in with a price of $4.2 million. And I said, no, he's going to go broke. There's no way you could build this with 4.2. So we had to teach him all over again how to build this, and finally we gave him 4.7 million to do it, and he made money, and he was happy. So that's the building under construction, and you can see the plywood forms, they're all at an angle, and then the windows are all at an angle. So this curve and this curve is exactly the same curve, they just flipped. So every piece, even the plywood pieces, we didn't cut the 4x8 sheets of plywood, we reused them over and over again in its own form. And there's the building that we had finished with the university on top of the shopping center, and this is the new building. So these two buildings, this building is vertical with a twist that's vertical, and this is a building that's got a twist that's horizontal. So they're kind of talking to each other, a little bit like Arena talking to the Washington Monument. Right? So that's the wall on the curve. And now they're building the city hall, so it's under construction site. That's where you got a big hole here, and they're building the plaza. So this is facing the plaza. There's the other building that we designed. And then the interior, we wanted to create, see, libraries are very interesting because libraries are the new sanctuaries. They're the new cathedrals of our age, because people think, well, with electronic media, everything, nobody's going to read anymore. I think libraries are going to become much more important, but for a different reason. They become sanctuary because I think we live in smaller and smaller spaces. So the libraries are spaces where you can go to hang out. And if you have dual income, dual earning couples, you know, they go there when the children go to sleep. So we went to one library in Phoenix that said the busiest time was between 10 p.m. and midnight, because that's when the kids are asleep and one of the parents can go out to study. So the idea was to create a public library that's function as a public space also. So it's stacking. We come from hockey countries, right? So this is a hockey stick. That's an L. So this L and this L, they're all interlocked with each other. I'll explain that a little bit more. So if you see the ground floor, that's the ground floor, or the public function, children's area, etc. Mind you, one of the big problem with children's area is where you put the buggies, the baby buggies. Because, you know, you come for reading time, so we have to develop a special area where the buggies could be lined up without cluttering the rest of the library. And then, of course, we have an automatic sorting area, which, great. Everybody stands up against the window to watch this machine going, sorting all your books. Right? And then you come up, so there's the first L, you come up and you turn over. So rather than having, there's a series of spaces, some for elderly people, some for literacy, for immigrants, some for children, and then back offices are tucked away at the back. And then the next L comes up and splinters this way, right? and then the other L comes across this way. So the stacks are in this area, and then you get tall spaces for reading in down here and up here. And we put a cafe right smack in the middle of the library. We had a wonderful librarian that didn't worry about food and drinks in the library. She said, take it everywhere you want, doesn't really matter. That's the new way how people use libraries. And then, of course, we put the typical green roof. And in the center, we created a skylight. So I wanted the library to have very good lighting in the sense that it becomes an interior light box, if you like. And I'll try to explain what that meant. So in the center, there is an oculus where the light comes through. And as the daylight changed, the building is painted by the skylight. So once we live here for a year, I'm going to then locate where the 12 noon solstice and equinox points are. So the children can come at noontime and watch the sun, boom, hits that spot, and we'll put a little mirror or something on it, and then the whole building will sparkle. So I'm waiting to do that next year. But you can see how this light just comes in and just paints the building as it goes around. And so you have this light in the middle, that kind of, and then you have these reading areas on the edge. So people watching people's space, I believe that in a library, peripheral vision is very important. You want to have private space where you can do your work, but you also want to have this peripheral vision. Like, there's this wonderful story I have to tell. I think if I'm wrong, but Marilyn, you tell me. I think it was the Rubels that told me. They were recording each other in the library. And I think Don was, I think it's the Rubels. If I'm wrong. Anyway, I think he was very shy, so he wouldn't talk to her, and she's not shy, but she didn't want to talk to him first. They sat across each other for a year, and then the first word he said to her was, "Will you marry me?" Now that's peripheral vision. I mean, I courted my wife in the library, and I know what that means, right? There are these kind of moments of kind of catching each other that I think libraries are very important for that. Anyways, and then on the edges of the space where we have the stacks, I didn't want to have dark corners in the library, so I brought in skylight at the edges. So there's not a dark corners in this library. It's always you're enveloped by light, but very soft light that changes during the day, that gives you a sense of how the space is changing. And of course, then on opening day, this became really, really popular. So this is the living room area where the seniors are with the fireplace. And then you can see how people are just kind of, it just opened last week. And then on opening day, it was fantastic. It was just like arena, 6,000 people showed up, and the place was just one big amphitheater, right? And we had classical music, we had dance performances, and now the opera wants to perform here every Saturday night, because this is an edge area of Vancouver, so the opera never goes, but the director of the opera came to saw this building. He said, this is where I'm going to have recitals on Saturday night. So it's become very, very well received and very popular in the community. But just like at Arena, two little kids came up, took one look at me and said, I want to be an architect. Right? At Arena, same thing happened, and it just, those are the moments as an architect you live for. So, thank you very much, and take some questions.